Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
Some sermons are meant to be, and some of them are very difficult. I was having some trouble with trying to put it together, and then I got to church and I had all my notes except for today.
Of course.
So I had to drive home and get it. It was sitting right where I left it on the table. And usually I'm up in my study, but Jean's out of town with the girls on a special trip. So I have all the animals, so I'm keeping the dogs in the kitchen. Well, you got dogs, cats, horses, you name it, I got all of them. And anyway,
Farmer Dan.
so I left it on the table. So I get back up here, and I look down, and I have one of 2 pages. The second page is still there.
The dog ate it.
So anyway, some days are just, I wish I could, if I let it get low enough, the dogs would, but anyway. But we've been going through the series on bend in the roads. We all have them. You never know whether they're going to come up and the difficulty. And today the title comes from basically a student I had was not a believer when I had him, and kind of a rowdy individual. After he graduated, he got into a lot of trouble, ended up in McAllister. And while he was there, he basically turned his life over to the Lord and came to know Christ. And just kind of had a vision one night when the Lord was speaking to him, and just coming up out of the ashes. And his company now today is Phoenix. I won't give you the rest of it. But if you know much about Phoenix, that's the Greek mythology. And it's the bird, basically, that comes up out of the ashes, and it's from the sun god and has immortality. And if those of you that know much about cars will know the Phoenix is what is on the Pontiac Trans Am, or often called the Firebird. So, although it's supposed to be immortal, we don't find any Pontiacs today, do we? So when I think about it, here you have David with the life that he has, and he's running all over the place. And out of the ashes, what can God do when you're out running and you have so many things? And in the background, it's going to be coming from 2 different Psalms, but the background, if you want to turn to 1 Samuel 21, in chapter 20, you find that Jonathan basically makes that pact after he realizes his dad is trying to kill him. He then, Michal, his wife, David's wife, spares his life. And then you find Samuel is sparing his wife. And then you also find that the priest helps spare his life. So when you get to chapter 21 of 1 Samuel, you have the priest sparing his life. And then when you go down in verse 10, humanly speaking, where would be a good place to flee? If the king and all his army is chasing after you, a good natural human place would be in verse 11. He goes to the Philistines. Hey, Saul won't come here after the Philistines, but obviously somebody recognizes him there. And notice in verse 11, servants are saying, what do you have in him here? Saul is slaying thousands, David is 10,000. Hey, why do you want to have this guy who's so notorious? And it's also interesting when you look at it, he's with the Philistines, and what did he take with him in verse 9 when he leaves the priest?
Holy bread.
He takes Goliath's sword. Well, how do you want to have Goliath's sword when you go into the Philistines? Don't you think they'll recognize that sword? There's not many that could weld it. When you think about it. So obviously David then realizes, hey, the king could have him put to death, so he pretends to be insane. And you notice the king, which would be 5 city-states, would be the king of the city, basically said, man, I've got enough crazy people around here, I don't need another one. So he kicks him out. Obviously David was faking it to spare his life. David leaves there, and you notice now he escapes to the cave. There's two caves that David goes to that are mentioned in Scripture. One of them is here in chapter 21, or 22 rather, in verse 1. And the other one is in chapter 24. So you find him, he escapes here. Notice who comes to him. So his family comes. And you stop and think about it. If they are after David, what about his family? How safe is their family? You know, if you're trying to kill David, one quick way to get it is to go after your family. So they come to him. And then notice who else joins him. Everyone who is in distress, in debt, and discontent. What 3 Ds? Well, wouldn't you love to have? You notice there's 400 of them. Everybody who's in debt, distressed, or discontent, come and join you. Wouldn't you love to lead a group like that? What happens is Saul had started levying some heavy taxes on people, and people can't pay it. They're in debt. And so they come and join up with this band. So here you are, you can't go anywhere. You're David, you're fleeing, and your family's there because they're basically fleeing. And now we have all these others, 400 people. And how would you like to be the leader? You didn't ask to be the leader, you just all of a sudden became a leader of these group. It says he's the captain of them. So David decides in verse 3, I'm going to go to Moab. If you remember, his grandmother's from what? Ruth the Moabitess. So he goes there and he asks the king to take care of his father and his mother and his family. And he leaves. And notice in verse 5, what does the prophet Gad says to David? Do not stay in a stronghold, return to the land of Judah. As soon as he crosses over from the land of the Philistines to the land of Judah, who's going to be looking for him? Now, how many of you want to follow the Lord? Hey, Lord, I'm safe here, and you're now telling me to go back to Judah, and as soon as I cross over to Judah, what's going to happen? I mean, I don't think we really realize. You notice how bad it is because this in the next verses, Saul goes out and has 85 priests killed who he thought helped David out. I mean, anybody that helps David is going to get killed. So here you have this going on. You notice then he also returns to Judah, and in chapter 23, it's even interesting. David is outside the cliff, and the Philistines. What happens is when the Philistines were very opportunistic. They would let Israel plant all the crops, and they'd let them, right at harvest time, they'd come in with their army, and what would they do? They'd steal all the crops. So you did all the work, and they'd come in and steal all of it. And so David, I think it's interesting, in verse 2, David says, Lord, should I go take them on? Now remember, right now the Philistines aren't upset with David. And you have, just across the border, he's in Judah, and the Philistines are coming to take these people's possessions. Now if you go after the Philistines, who are you now going to have against you? The Philistines and Saul. And you'll notice God says to go attack the Philistines to deliver them. And notice in verse 3, David's men said, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more if we go to attack the Philistines? David asks again, and God says to do it. In verse 4, and they then go and they attack the Philistines with a great slaughter and bring all the things back to the inhabitants. Now, if you were the city, what should you do if you were David? You ought to really be thankful. Notice David then asks God in verse 10, 11, and 12, will the people of the city who I just rescued and all their possessions, will they turn me over to Saul? And the answer was yes. I just helped deliver them, and they're not going to turn me over. Now you get the background of what's happening in Psalms 56, 57. So let's turn over to Psalms for a moment. Let's look and see what's going on. How would you be feeling? What would you write? You have, everybody's after you. Now Philistines are wanting you. Saul and his men are wanting you. the people of the land who you're supposed to be king over, they don't want you. So what does he do? You notice that this is the background. Again, like I said, all it says on the caption is it's in a cave, but we're not told which cave. You'll notice in Psalms 56, at the very top, it says when he was in Gath. You remember that's what we saw. And it's interesting just for two verses. In verse 4, and verse also then when you look in verse 11, notice he says that he puts his trust in God. What can man do to me? Twice. Well, what can man do to him? Kill him. And his answer is, okay, so man kills me. I'm going to die anyway one day. Where do I go? I have eternal life. So notice that's his conclusion when he thinks about what here with the deal. What would we write? So that takes you then to Psalms 57, and if you look at the top, it says when he fled from Saul into the cave. So that takes us where we're at. I want you to look at in verse 1 down to verse 6, what he does. Each day is a day of prayer. And the reason I say it's a day, you'll notice in verse 4 he lies down, in verse 8 he wakes up. So this was one day in his life. And notice what it says. Notice the request. Be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me. Now, grace is unmerited favor. Couldn't David say, you owe it to me, or whatever? Notice, he's turning to God and saying, be gracious. Don't give me what I deserve, but be gracious to me. And notice the reason. For my soul takes refuge in thee. In the shadow of thy wings I'll take refuge. Well, didn't he just get through trying to take refuge in Philistine? Didn't he just try to take refuge in Moab? Didn't he try to help out the city? So he's basically saying what? Only place I can take refuge is in you and under your wings. Do you remember in Matthew 23, Jesus said that he wanted to gather Jerusalem and Israel under his wings, and they wouldn't. How many of us are willing to get under his wings and stay there? Or how many of us want to go out and try to do things on our own? And I think you remember in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not on thy own understanding. On all thy ways acknowledge him, he'll direct your path. It doesn't make sense to go attack the Philistines. It doesn't make sense to go into Saul's territory. Saul is hunting him twice, you'll find in the two passages. He's hunting him. He takes the 3,000 best soldiers he's got to go after David. It wasn't just a ragtag team. He has 3,000 of the best. He's coming after him. So notice the results. One, I think we need to remain under his wings. Notice, I think it's interesting too, keep reading. Until the destruction passes, I'll cry to God the Most High, to God who accomplishes all things for me. He'll send from heaven and save me. His approach, him who tramples upon me. God will send forth his loving kindness and truth. Okay, whose work is it to protect him? God's. He's following God, and didn't God say he was going to be king? And has he been king yet? Nope. So you have to trust. I'm putting my trust in you. I'm following you. I'm coming back. Everybody's after me, but I'm trusting in you. And I think it's he's saying, God, I'll let you reprimand. You'll notice in these two passages we're looking at too. That's twice when Saul came into the cave and David cut off the road. But his people were, his army was saying what? Kill him. He also then, when you get to 2 chapters later, he goes into the camp of Saul, and God causes a deep sleep on him, and he picks up the spear, and he picks up the water jug, and he goes out. Could he not have killed him right there? But he says, it's not for me to put my hand against not God's anointed. When God wants me to be king, he'll make me king, and he'll take Saul out in his time. I think it's important for us to look at it when you think about it, out of the ashes. I mean, humanly speaking, David, it's only a matter of time. David is a dead man, humanly speaking. Trusting in the Lord when he knows. So think about it. Who or what am I taking refuge in? I think a lot of it, we take refuge in a lot of different things, but what are we taking it in? And I want you to also notice, does he recognize the situation he's in? David knows exactly what he's in. He's not trying to hide it or cover it up or anything else. Notice starting in verse 7, I think it's interesting. Well, we'll go down from verse 4 down to verse 6 when he recognizes his situation. My soul is among lions. I must lie down among those who breathe forth fire, even the sons of men whose teeth are spears and arrows. Their tongues are sharp sword. That's true for all of them around him. They're all ready to turn him in. They're all ready to kill him. They're all ready to do everything. And notice he's basically saying to the Lord, I'm turning it over to you. You take care of him. Verse 7, verse 6. How much willing to do that? Lord, they're in your hands. I'm going to turn them over to you. And I think it's interesting when you look at it, how many of us remain under his wings and then we give him the credit when it happens? How many of us will get under his wing, and then it reminds me a lot, I see a lot of animals at work, a lot of rabbits and different things like that, and they'll get underneath of my different equipment. They're perfectly safe. You have a lot of coyotes and stuff. As soon as you get close to the tank, what do? They run out in the open. Why in the world are they running out where prey can get them? You know, you have eagles, you have all of it out there just ready for them. And it's like, but how many of us do the same thing? We're safe under his wing, but we run right out in the open, unprotected. Notice, I think, verse 7 down to 11, each day is a day to give praise. Now, how many of us would be like David praising God when you're hiding in a cave and people are out to get you? And notice what he says, my heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing, yes, I will praise. I will awaken my glory, awaken the harp, the lyre, awaken the dawn. Now, how many of us are ready to go sing? You just lost your job. They just said you have cancer. Whatever it might be. Say, well, God, you're in charge. You know everything. I'm hiding under your wings. I'm going to sing praise. Well, did he give us today? He didn't have to give us today. So notice he's ready to sing in the midst of it. Notice what he says in verse 9 and 10. I will give thanks to thee among the people. Humanly speaking, what does David have to give thanks for? Okay, there's a lot of things. If you look at the previous chapters, which we didn't look at, when Saul is chasing after him and trying to find him, Saul looks all over and can't find him. God protects him. But Jonathan comes and Jonathan finds him. Now, how can Jonathan find him and Saul and his 3,000 men can't? Because God wanted Jonathan to find him to encourage him, but he didn't want Saul's men to find him. Notice, notice in verse 11, be exalted above heavens, O God, let thy glory be above all the earth. David wants to showcase God and not himself. It's interesting, he asks each time before he goes and fights the Philistines or anything else, Lord, should I go? Should I do this? Should I go after, when they captured the people in Ziklag, should I go after them? I think it's interesting how much you're willing to look, Lord, what should I do? And then give God the credit on different things. So, the question again is, will I remain under his wing and then sing praises and give thanks to all he's done? There is always something to thank the Lord for. Always. How many of you were thankful for air conditioning this last month? How many of you were thankful for some hot water? If you don't, just go overseas once. And see what it's like when air conditioning runs a short period of time, or maybe I should say electricity runs a short period of time. You don't have hot water only parts of the time. I mean, it's really difficult. So that gives us the background then of and the Psalms 57. Remember, he was in the cave. He's run, followed God. He starts each day with praise, and he starts each day with prayer. What about you and I? What can we do? Now, if you go back to the story, go back then to 1 Samuel for a moment. Notice in verse 23, chapter 23 of 1 Samuel. Because he writes another psalm while he's here. It's Psalms 142. But before he does it, let's get a little more of the background. 23, 1 Samuel 23. Notice in verse 14, David stayed in the wilderness, and strongholds remained in the hills, the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. Notice again who's keeping him from him. Now David was aware that Saul was out to seek him. And notice verse 16. Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David and encouraged him. Now basically, who is in line to become king after Saul? Jonathan. Notice, I think it's interesting in verse 17. Jonathan said to David, "Do not be afraid, because the hand of my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I'll be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also." Now, how many of you, if maybe Jonathan would say, "Hey, you're the next king, not me, and I'll support you when you could be king"? I'm sure that's part of why in the battle when they lost at the Philistines, Jonathan's life was taken, all because of that fact, so that he would not have a division as a result. But it's amazing when you look at it, a little bit of the background. He encourages him. So notice in verse 19, he goes with Ziph, you remember? And notice what do? Ziphites, they come in verse 19 and they tell Saul where he's at. That's nice of them, isn't it? You're out there helping them out, defending them, and they turn you in. So notice it's getting pretty bad, how bad it is. Notice how close they get. You notice that Saul's men are seeking. You notice in verse 26 of 23, Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men are on the other side of the mountain. David was hurrying to get away from Saul, for Saul and his men were surrounding David and his men to seize him. Looks pretty bleak, doesn't it? Your men, they got a whole lot more. Choice men, they're surrounding you. They're closing in. And notice how God takes care of it. 27. The messenger came to Saul saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid on the land." Just when he's about to get David, who's attacking homeland? The Philistines. Oh, they got to leave David. Now they got to go defend. So they leave. Notice then in verse 24, David then goes to the wilderness, and this is the second cave that he's at. And David is there. And notice again what happens. After the battle, then Saul comes back with 3,000 men and starts looking for him in all the different caves. And this is when they come into the cave, if you remember, and he cuts off part of his robe. And if you look a little bit further, down a little bit further, when you look in the passage, you get to chapter 26. It's interesting in 1 Samuel. Once again, in verse 1, the Ziphites turn him in again. Boy, wouldn't you love? You stop and think about it. When you do become king, how many of these cities would you get even with? You notice it's never recorded David ever did. Human nature. So here he is, he's now going to spare him, if you remember when he falls asleep and he basically has his spear. So then that gives you the background of Psalms 142. So turn over to Psalms 142. You notice again you have it at the top. Talking about a David when he was in a cave. It's a prayer. How would you be praying when you think about all this going on? And I want you to realize, first of all, the discouragement of David. We'll see that in some different verses. Notice in verse 3, "My spirit was overwhelmed within me. Thou didst know my path, the way where I walk." He's discouraged. Would you be discouraged? And notice in verse 4, Look to the right and see, but there is no one who regards me. There's no escape from me. No one cares for my soul. He has no refuge, nowhere to go. I think so often we don't realize when we think of David, a man after God's own heart, it was not easy for him. Not easy for him. What about in verse 6? Give heed to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors. They're too strong for me. So he's discouraged, he feels deserted, he's depressed, and he's defeated. Any of you ever felt that way? How often do we feel that way? So when you think about it, are you discouraged, depressed, defeated? What do you do about it? I think David can tell us what he's going to do about it. Notice what he tells you here. How did you defeat it? Notice, I think, the first one in this particular psalm. Notice in verse 1 and 2, I cried aloud with my voice. I make supplication with my voice to the Lord. I poured out my complaint before him. I declared my troubles before him. The word there for troubles, by the way, is tight places. He's in a cave, and Saul comes into the cave. And it says the men hid themselves, David's men hid themselves in the recesses. That's pretty tight places. So I think the first thing in defeating the discouragement, register your complaint with God. Does he know it anyway? Then why don't we tell him about it? Notice in verse 3, I think it's interesting. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, thou didst know my path and the way where I'll walk. Does God know where you're at? Does God know your path? He knows where you're at, and he knows where to take you. So I think it's interesting. One is you register it, realize he knows exactly where I'm at. And I think we need to do the same thing. Register it. Hey, you know where I'm at? You know my path? And help me out? God doesn't have to use the GPS every time we get off, okay? He knows where we're at. Notice in verse 5. It says, I cry out to thee, O Lord, I say, thou art my refuge. Remember, your only refuge is really with who? With the Lord. It's not with our finances. It's not with our health. Because I think the older you get, how many are beginning to realize your health is breaking down. Your strength is breaking down. Everything's happening. You also realize that it doesn't take much for your financial security to be gone. That can be gone in a very, very short period of time. Notice the roles that I think it's helpful for us to remember. Notice in verse 6, give heed to my cry, for I'm brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors. They're too strong for me. Okay. Who is the captain? Who's led me here? Who told me to go to Judea? You are the shepherd. I'm the sheep. I go where you tell me. And I think it's important for us to recognize to go there. And I don't think it's much easier because most of us will try to guide things with our own human logic and so on. That's what happened with Abraham, is it not? She's my sister because I don't think God can keep me alive. You know? You have throughout the Old Testament, when people try to do things on their own, all it does is cause problems. And so I think it's interesting when you look at it. Notice I think it's in verse 7. Things haven't changed. He's still hiding in the cave. And notice what does he promise? Bring my soul out of prison. And I imagine it felt like a prison inside there. So that I may give thanks to thy name. The righteous will surround me. For thou wilt deal bountifully with me. How many of you are ready to give thanks and praise? Or how many of you would say, Lord, it's about time. I don't think you should have kept me here to begin with. Now I think you owed me at least this much. David doesn't say any of that. He's ready to give thanks. And I don't think we really realize, when you look through it at Job, but what about when you look at with Joseph? Joseph was only 17 when all that started to happen to him. And he's 30, so for 13 years, how much of his life was he really struggling with a lot of different things? But because of what he went through, he was ready to lead and ready to trust the Lord. Often when God is taking us through, He's preparing us for something else. But we don't know what He's preparing us for because we will look at everything by our sight and so on. God's preparing us. So when you think about this, when you look at David in different times, he's running and he writes 2 of these Psalms. Am I registering my complaint with God, or do I just stop there? How do we register our complaint? We're really good about telling God about our problems, and we stop there. Do I realize He knows where I'm at and will help me if I'll take refuge in Him? But then I also have to follow His plan. It's just like the person, that I was mentioning, the former student of mine. His company's doing very well today. But he recognized it was his mistakes that he made, that he needed the Lord. He went back to what he realized was a child, had never accepted Christ, that accepted Christ, accepted the consequences, and he's got a thriving business today. God help him out. So I think it's interesting. He's also in church, studying the Word of God, all those things he needs to help him. But we can all be like that. Out of the ashes, we can rise up and do a lot of things. And obviously, David was, every king and leader of Israel afterwards always compared to who? To David. You think about it. Everybody is compared to David and his great leadership. God's training him all kinds of things along the way. God's training you and I too. What's He training us for?
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace Himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.